And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. Your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. Shortly after being sworn in as Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney answered a call for a snap election after U.S. President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on the country, sparking a trade war. On today's Open Connection, we meet with political pundit Nathan Collin.
There's a lot of things that are happening now. Things are really heating up. And, I'm reaching out to you because you have been there. You have been on the local scene and you have actually been on the federal scene. And I was coming to you for some of your wisdom or some of your experience on what's going on and why is the Northwest all of a sudden becoming important in this election?
The election timing is not great. Let's be frank. The softwood lumber industry, for example, I heard the premier today, he was on CNN and Fox, and they're getting a lot of attention in the States because the Americans are just hammering our forestry industry right at a time when they need our products the most, right? A bunch of Los Angeles burned down. 1 out of every 10 sticks of lumber in the US comes out of BC. And we're good neighbors. We got good product and we want to sell it to them. The Americans are making that harder and harder and life more and more expensive. The timing of this federal election is a very short one. It was a snap election after Mr. Carney won the leadership. So they never returned back to Parliament. The NDP was saying, we got to get a bunch of stuff done for workers who are about to lose their jobs. So we've already seen auto workers lose their jobs, lumber workers, people in the tourism sector. So we're already seeing the impacts of Donald Trump. He's cratering the stock market. Trillions of dollars in people's retirement have just poof in a month. So having a strong government is going to be important, and having a government that's accountable. And I really appreciated the role the NDP played in the last parliament in making sure things like dental care suddenly is a reality for 4.5 million Canadians who didn't have it before, and also pushing pharmacare. So things like diabetes medication, those kinds of things become free for Canadians as opposed to people spending up to $1,000 a month on life-saving drugs. So I always like parliaments that no one has all the power and that people's voices, every MP's voice is heard. Those are the kinds of parliaments I think get the most done for Canadians. Here in the Northwest, we are very much on the map, which, just to give people some perspective, 20 years ago wasn't the case. That, you'd see an election after election, we were an afterthought, if we were thought of at all. And so it's really good. I, as a Northwesterner, love that we get that kind of attention because it means the issues that we're talking about at a local level can be addressed by provincial and federal parties and the government, which has a lot of influence. Some of that attention can also be negative, I guess, that misunderstanding how the North works. You get, career politicians like Mr. Poilievre coming in and says, I have this magic wand and this is how resources are going to work. And just, it's unfortunate because it does the whole conversation a disservice. It's a really important conversation. It's one to get right, and it's not going to be won by a bunch of slogans. But I think it's going to be a really critical election, and what comes out of Skeena, Bulkley Valley, is going to matter not just obviously to our region, but right across the country.
It's an icon that has been around since even before Canada was Canada, and that's Hudson Bay Company. So I understand it was purchased by a U.S. company and then gutted, for lack of a better word.
That's exactly what happened. That's there are certain hedge funds that get after a company. They want to squeeze the value out of it and then shut it down. That there's an actual business model where you take even sometimes viable businesses. Hudson Bay was in a lot of trouble. It's also got a troubled legacy, as we know here in the Northwest, particularly with respect to First Nations people. But to see a company that is one of the oldest in the world get gutted by a New York hedge fund in a matter of months is it's a bit concerning, but it almost is a bit symbolic of the attacks that the president is making on Canada in general. Like some attempt, and he said this, that I'm going to squeeze you so hard economically that I'm going to make you the 51st state. Well, he's misreading and misunderstanding Canadians if he thought that would work. It's been one of the most interesting times. Yeah, like the elbows up thing is real. You see people every day making purchases and decisions, not traveling to the States. We canceled a trip down to a friend's wedding, which is, it's too bad. You want to be able to go see friends and family in the US, but this isn't a time to do it because they're not acting like friends. So that's all happening, and that's the context of this election. Meanwhile, there are other issues, right? The issues of affordability, of building more homes, of doing those kinds of things. I think for a large percentage of voters, once they step past the Trump stuff, are saying is important to them as well. And I think the leaders are trying to address it, but you can see so much of the attention is being sucked up by the chaos of Trump. I think it's what's been hurting the conservatives as well. If you remember, even like a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, they were up 25, 30 points in the polls, like sailing away with this. But because I think Poilievre uses so much of the language and tone that Trump uses, he calls people's names, he attacks the media, he is attacking so-called woke culture and all this stuff, very, very similar to Trump. 6 months ago, that didn't matter as much. Now the Canadians have seen that kind of politician once they're in power. It seems to be very much affecting Mr. Poilievre, and he's having a struggle to differentiate himself and to change what he's been doing for years and the way he's been doing it, which was effective, I guess, for a moment, but is certainly not very effective right now.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. For decades, federal election campaigns for main political parties have provided seats on leaders' tours, with media organizations paying the party for travel and other fees, so that journalists can access events, ask questions to hold leaders to account, and closely observe the campaigns. Let us return the conversation as Colin reflects on this decision.
Trump did it for sure. Near dictators like Viktor Orban in Hungary. There's been a few of these folks that don't like the media. And they don't like the media for a reason, which is they don't like to be asked questions. They want to control what you hear about them. You guys in the media do this thing where you ask questions that are not scripted by the party, by the political masters. So what Poilievre has done is thrown all the media off his bus and planes. They're not allowed to come on. I think they get maybe one question a day of the campaign, and that's it. And the reason that's a problem is because elections are the best time that voters get a chance to see who wants to be leader and answer tough questions, because governing is hard. You don't get to control everything. But Mr. Poilievre has learned a different lesson where he thinks the media is the enemy and paints them as such and has said as such, and then gets this just control through his own streams. So it's very disappointing. I hope it doesn't work just in a broader sense. Forget the partisan stuff, because media play a really important role of holding very powerful people accountable for their promises, what they say, and if they get in trouble, like this Aaron Gunn thing, is a candidate for the Conservatives on Vancouver Island, has said, residential schools were asked for by First Nations people. They weren't that bad. We shouldn't disparage them, he says. And that's all in line with people who deny the effects and the attempts by government to eliminate Indigenous people from Canada and murder them. Never mind the indoctrination. Well, Poilievre has tossed 4 or 5 of his candidates so far just last week, but he won't get rid of this guy. I guess denying residential school trauma and the terror of that whole thing is not enough to disqualify you in Pierre Poilievre's mind, that he thinks this guy should be a legislator. And I don't know, in the Northwest here, I'm trying to imagine Ellis Ross or the Conservatives running around in the campaign saying residential schools were not that bad and First Nations asked for it anyways. I can't imagine that being true, and I just don't know why the Conservatives would want to be associated to somebody who thinks that way.
We get to know who we're talking to based off who they surround themselves with, and so as far as the Conservatives go in BC, I understand that Aaron Gunn was not even, he wasn't even allowed to run for leadership in BC, and they took off his hat in the federal election.
That's right. That's right. He wanted to run, I think, for the BC United, the BC Liberals. That they kept changing their name, but they disqualified him, and I think it was because a lot of these he wants to privatize healthcare. Like there's a bunch of things that he believes in and puts it up on social media, then deletes them. But I mean, come on, it's we have a record. This is not hard to figure out. So he wasn't good enough for conservatives in BC, but he certainly seems to have Mr. Poilievre's favor. And I don't know, I'm for debate. I'm for people saying things. I'm for people saying controversial things, but you got to be held accountable to them. You got to answer for them. And Mr. Poilievre is not being accountable for this. I'd love to hear Mr. Ross's opinion on these comments from Mr. Gunn. But we'll see. It's very hard to ask these guys questions because they don't make themselves available. I wish they'd come on your show, the candidates, particularly Taylor Bachrach and Ellis, and answer questions from you or from viewers. I think this is such an important election. The more information people have directly from the candidates, not filtered through Elon Musk's algorithm on Twitter, I think the better, because this is going to be a very important choice for people.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. In 2012, the Northern Gateway Project faced widespread opposition from First Nations groups, environmental organizations, and some residents of BC. The major concerns about environmental impact on the pipeline include the potential for oil spills on sensitive coastal ecosystems, were a major point of contention. Let us turn the conversation with Nathan.
In my 20 years in politics, they just constantly on the table because big oil companies in Calgary that are not even, most of them are not Canadian, but whatever, really want to build, or did. They say they don't now, which is curious. It only seems to be the Conservatives who are trying to push an oil pipeline through northwestern BC. We fought for, well, a generation. First Nations came up together with Conservatives and Liberals and NDP and fishermen and local mayors and said, no, that we are not willing to entertain the risks that a diluted bitumen pipeline would pose on the Northwest because our environment's important, salmon's important. And these risks, you can never clean up one of these spills. Well, I can remember when we got the North Coast tanker ban into Parliament, and Poilievre was really, kind of muted about it, but now is dead set against it. I think this is a killer issue in the Northwest. I think whether you're right or left or middle, the idea that a big, massive oil spill from a pipeline or a tanker that will last forever is a good idea. I just don't see a lot of people on the doorstep saying they want this. And so Poilievre's also talking about an energy corridor where people would just sign off forever without even knowing what project is being proposed, and just then they would have a permit to build whatever they want. I don't think that's smart, and it's not very conservative because you're signing a blank check. You're saying we will give away our power as a local municipality or a province or maybe even a First Nation for a project that doesn't even exist yet. So you can just build whatever you want in there. And there's a big difference between someone putting a water pipeline down and a diluted bitumen pipeline. Those aren't the same thing. That's why we go through a permit process so that we can engage the public and find out what's happening and do it in a good way so that everybody at the end of the day understands what's happening. Well, yes and no, right? So a municipality obviously has a voice, and if there's something, in the actual town where a major project goes through, they may have a small permit, but predominantly it's the province, it's First Nations and the feds. What he's missing is, through relationship and understanding, the province of BC has already been able to make agreements with First Nations to have what's called a joint environmental assessment process. So with the Teltan over mines, over particular mines, we'll say, let's do the environmental assessment together. But you can't force that. You can't force that politically, and you can't force that legally. He can, introduce whatever bill he wants, that it's going to be one permit and you're all going to say yes. And that will get shot down immediately by a thing called the Constitution of Canada. So unless he's planning to also change the Constitution, this is garbage. It's not a real idea. And it's unfortunate because some people will say, Mom, maybe that makes sense. It's illegal. It would not work. And it reminds me of some other criminal reforms where they would change laws, sentencing laws for people, which the lawyers at the time said, that's not good. It's going to get challenged and it's going to get thrown out. But the Conservatives for years under Harper with Poilievre said, we'll just lock up these guys forever. And people who were scared thought this is a good idea or maybe this would work, even though the Conservatives cynically knew it wouldn't. So those cases got thrown out, people didn't go to jail, and it didn't make things better with respect to crime. I get frustrated sometimes about that. It's like, let's think innovatively, let's do different things, let's challenge systems. But when you propose something that you know is unconstitutional and is not going to survive, then it's just cynicism. And that's just trying to scare up a few votes in the middle of an election, which is what I think Mr. Poilievre's doing. Well, in BC, it's getting easier because the BC government has changed laws to allow zoning and permitting to happen dramatically faster than Ontario, faster than Quebec, faster than Alberta. You want to build them right. We've seen housing crashes before where there's just oversupply, but we've been undersupplied for years. And we allowed previous governments, particularly under Christy Clark and Stephen Harper, foreign offshore numbered accounts would buy up thousands of homes, speculate on them. They were sitting empty. All those condo towers in Vancouver built empty because people were just flipping them for investments. BC government brought in changes so that is not an incentive anymore because, building a house should be a home. We also changed some of the Airbnb laws because in some towns, you got 20-30% or more of the rental stock was now short-term rentals for Airbnb when people's rents were going up. So there's been a supply problem. So the NDP proposing to build more homes is in line and correct with what a lot of the other parties are saying. NDP is a bit more ambitious. It also creates a ton of jobs. Why do we build these homes? Well, because we kind of didn't for 20 years. And when the federal Liberals had power in the 90s, they got the federal government out of home building entirely, affordable housing. And the NDP wants the federal government back in a major way. And in the last parliament did help push for more affordable housing and the federal government to play their role in it. It just makes sense. Every other Western democracy does this. But when they were cutting budgets back in the 90s, the Liberals pulled the feds out. And it took until now to get them back in a little bit.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
At one time, the single-family residence was the epitome of having attained the dream. But today, that dream has been largely replaced by the need to survive. You might be wondering at this point, why are things like rent so high so that people are just barely scraping by? In this final segment of Open Connection, Nathan shares how real estate investment trusts are removing homes from the housing market.
Very, very large company. They're called REITs, R-E-I-Ts, and they can be investment companies from the States or Europe, and they can end up owning thousands and thousands of units. That is a business model. The NDP government here in BC has been moving against them. I don't have the latest in terms of what proposals, but it really distorts the market. Because there's such a high profit motive within them. These are not home builders. They're just sucking up the supply. They crank rent. They crank the cost of buying a home. And especially for young Canadians coming up, we need to do everything we can so that a young person, a young couple in their 20s and 30s has a chance. And letting investors rip us off from some, hedge fund in New York is just the opposite of a good housing plan. And so we've got to pay attention to those kinds of things because it's real. And it's billions and billions of dollars that these guys are looking to make off Canadian housing, but not really provide any more housing, just make money off the stock that's there. We already have revenue sharing with a lot of First Nations governments right now here in BC. companies are already kind of doing this, particularly in the natural resource sector. I don't know if giving taxpayer money to companies or changing the tax law further federally is going to, we got to look at it. But in BC, that's, again, on the natural resource side, that's a very common thing that agreements get signed between companies and First Nations for some revenue sharing. The BC government does that already on lumber and a few other commodities where we establish a way to share revenue so you can lift people up for the resources that are in their territories. So there's nothing revolutionary about that idea. It's been happening for a long time. It was an NDP government that did it. If Mr. Poilievre has some version of it, then that's interesting. But you got to look at people's intentions. And what I've noticed about Mr. Poilievre is he agrees with First Nations as long as they agree with him. And if they're opposing his ideas, they call them all kinds of names. So it's a fair weather friend thing. And I think for people in the Northwest, you got a guy like Taylor Bachrach there who's just been a longtime ally of First Nations people. And that's what a chief phoned me yesterday to talk about. That counts for a lot more than words coming out of Poilievre's mouth in the middle of a campaign where he's losing votes. Yeah, he has said all these things. I mean, I lament it, Robert, because how are we still in this conversation in 2025 where you have people running for prime minister who have a record of disparaging First Nations people so badly? But we do in Mr. Poilievre. I don't know his heart, but I know his words, and his words have been very unfortunate. And I'll let it's not me. It's First Nations leaders that have been calling for Mr. Poilievre to dump Mr. Gunn and others, and so I'll let them carry that torch for sure. It's just a lament. Like we're trying to bring people together. That's what Taylor does. That's what we try to do here in our politics in the Northwest. And you have a lot of these voices that still think it's, a different era where pitting First Nations against non-First Nations people is a strategy to win power. And it's unfortunate. Yeah. I mean, what's important to you? Living here in the Northwest, hearing these proposals, what is it that matters to you? And cost of living has been very important. The response to Donald Trump has been very important. Also, that's social safety net. Like, I've talked to people who are now getting dental care for the first time in their lives, and they're in their 60s. And that can change a life. Well, who made that happen? Well, it was the NDP pushing the government. Who's going to cancel it? Who's going to keep it? Those are kinds of important questions as well, because that just affects your pocketbook. I bet you there's a lot of regret south of the border right now. A lot of Americans who are somehow surprised, who voted for Trump, that he's doing the things that he said he would do, but he's just causing so much damage, attacking Canada. I hope people are really thinking about the day after the election, not just the day two, and who's going to be your voice. I just see Taylor's work and effort getting around the riding is pretty incredible, and just making connections with people. And I think ultimately in the Northwest, that matters a lot.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.